Johann Schmidt gripped his rifle with calloused hands as German artillery shells screamed overhead toward French positions across the muddy Marne battlefield. At 19 years old, he was one of thousands of young farm boys who had been conscripted into the Imperial German Army during the desperate summer of 1918, when Germany's final offensive was attempting to break through Allied lines before American reinforcements could tip the balance irreversibly against the Central Powers. But this former potato farmer from a small Bavarian village was about to demonstrate that courage and tactical instinct could emerge from the most unlikely backgrounds. Johann had grown up on his family's modest farm near the village of Rosenheim, working the land alongside his father and 3 younger brothers. His entire world had consisted of the 40 acres his family cultivated, the local church where they worshipped every Sunday, and the weekly market in town where they sold their produce. He had never traveled more than 20 miles from home, had minimal formal education beyond basic reading and arithmetic, and had expected to inherit the farm and live out his days in the same quiet agricultural routine his family had followed for generations. When war erupted in August 1914, Johann had been only 15 years old, too young for military service, but old enough to understand that the conflict would fundamentally change his world. His 2 older cousins had immediately volunteered for the army, marching off to what everyone believed would be a short, glorious war that would end with German victory by Christmas. Neither cousin had returned, one killed at Tannenberg, the other dying of typhus in a military hospital after surviving the trenches of Verdun. By 1918, Germany's manpower situation had become so desperate that conscription had been extended to include boys as young as 18. Johann's call-up notice had arrived in March, just as spring planting season was beginning. His departure for military training had left his aging father struggling to work the farm with only Johann's younger brothers to help, knowing that the harvest would likely fail without sufficient labor. Johann's military training had been abbreviated and inadequate, reflecting Germany's deteriorating capacity to properly prepare soldiers for modern warfare. He received 6 weeks of basic instruction in rifle handling, bayonet fighting, and trench warfare tactics, then was immediately sent to the Western Front as a replacement for casualties the German armies were suffering at unsustainable rates. His first experience of combat had come during Germany's spring offensive, when General Ludendorff had thrown massive forces against Allied positions in a desperate gamble to achieve victory before American troops could arrive in decisive numbers. Johann had witnessed the initial German successes, then the gradual stalling of the offensive as Allied resistance stiffened and German supply lines became overextended. What would you do if you were thrown into the deadliest war in history with minimal training and no combat experience? By July 1918, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically against Germany. The spring offensive had exhausted German reserves without achieving decisive results, while American forces were arriving in France at rates exceeding 250,000 troops per month. Allied commanders, recognizing German weakness, had begun planning counteroffensives designed to break German defensive lines and force a decisive end to the war. Johann's regiment had been positioned along the Marne River as part of the defensive forces meant to protect the gains Germany had achieved during the spring offensive. The sector seemed relatively quiet during the first weeks of July, with only routine artillery exchanges and patrol activities, suggesting that both sides were content to maintain a temporary stalemate while reinforcing their positions. But Allied intelligence had been carefully concealing preparations for a massive counteroffensive designed to strike German forces when they were weakest and least prepared for sustained defensive operations. The attack, which would become known as the Second Battle of the Marne, was scheduled to begin on July 15th with coordinated assaults by French, British, American, and Italian forces against German positions throughout the Marne sector. The Allied bombardment that preceded the infantry assault began at 4 a.m. on July 15th, catching German forces completely unprepared for the intensity and scale of the attack. Thousands of artillery pieces poured shells into German trenches, command posts, and supply areas, creating devastation that exceeded anything Johann had experienced during his brief military service. Johann's first reaction to the bombardment was simple terror. The earth shook continuously from explosions that created craters large enough to swallow entire squads of soldiers, while the air filled with smoke and dust that made breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. The noise was so intense that it overwhelmed his senses, making coherent thought nearly impossible and reducing his world to pure survival instinct. As the artillery barrage continued, Johann huddled in a shell hole with 3 other soldiers from his company, all of them paralyzed by fear and the understanding that they were experiencing the prelude to a major Allied offensive that would likely sweep away their inadequate defenses. The experienced soldiers in his unit had told him that surviving such bombardments was largely a matter of luck. Either a shell landed directly on your position and you died instantly, or it landed elsewhere and you survived to face the infantry assault that would follow. The bombardment lasted for over 2 hours, during which time Johann's position changed from relative safety to desperate vulnerability. A direct hit on a nearby bunker killed his company commander and most of the unit's senior NCOs, leaving Johann's platoon leaderless and isolated as Allied infantry began advancing across no man's land toward German positions.
Have you ever faced a situation where all authority disappeared and you had to make decisions with no guidance? Johann's transformation from terrified farm boy to effective combat leader began during those chaotic moments when Allied forces were overrunning German positions that had been devastated by artillery fire. As French infantry approached his shell hole, Johann realized that his 3 companions were too shocked to resist effectively and would be killed or captured unless someone took charge of their defense. His response was purely instinctive, drawing on practical problem-solving skills he had developed during years of farm work, where unexpected challenges required immediate solutions. Johann recognized that his small group couldn't hold their current position against advancing Allied forces, but he also understood that retreating across open ground would expose them to machine gun fire that would certainly kill them. Instead, Johann led his 3 companions in a lateral movement along a communication trench that provided cover from direct fire while allowing them to reach a destroyed German machine gun position. The position had been abandoned after the artillery barrage killed its crew, but the weapon itself remained functional, providing the firepower necessary to delay the Allied advance. Johann had only basic training on machine gun operations, having fired such weapons just twice during his abbreviated military instruction. But his mechanical aptitude, developed through years of maintaining farm equipment, allowed him to quickly assess the weapon's condition and bring it into operation despite damage from the artillery bombardment. The machine gun position Johann had occupied provided excellent defensive capabilities, with overlapping fields of fire that covered multiple approach routes Allied infantry were using to advance through German positions. But operating the weapon required exposing himself to enemy fire, while his 3 companions provided supporting fire with their rifles and grenades. What followed was one of the most remarkable small-unit defensive actions of the entire battle. Johann's improvised machine gun team held their position for over 3 hours against repeated Allied assaults, inflicting casualties that delayed the enemy advance and allowed other German units to establish defensive positions that prevented complete collapse of the line. Johann's effectiveness as a machine gunner exceeded what anyone, including himself, would have believed possible. His farm-trained eye for estimating distances and his steady hand developed through years of precision work with agricultural tools translated directly into accurate fire that devastated attacking Allied infantry. His ability to remain calm under pressure, learned through agricultural crises where panic meant crop failure and potential starvation, allowed him to maintain effective fire discipline even when enemy soldiers were advancing within grenade range. Share your thoughts in the comments below about how practical skills from civilian life can translate to military effectiveness. But Johann's defensive action was notable not just for its tactical success, but for the humanity he maintained even during intense combat. When Allied wounded fell in front of his position, he ceased fire to allow stretcher bearers to recover casualties, understanding that killing medical personnel violated both military conventions and basic human decency. His three companions initially protested these temporary ceasefires, arguing that any pause in defensive fire endangered their own survival. Johann's response reflected values he had learned from his father during years of farm work. We fight when we must, but we don't kill men who are trying to save lives. Those are doctors and medics doing their duty, just like we're doing ours. When the wounded are cleared, we'll resume fighting. This combination of effective combat action and respect for humanitarian principles made Johann's defensive stand exceptional, even by the standards of a war that had already witnessed countless examples of individual courage. He was demonstrating that it was possible to be an effective soldier while maintaining the moral principles that should govern human behavior even during warfare's most intense moments. As afternoon turned to evening, the Allied offensive began to lose momentum as German reinforcements arrived to stabilize the defensive line. Johann's machine gun position had become a focal point for German defensive efforts, with officers directing additional forces to support the young farm boy who was single-handedly holding a critical sector against overwhelming Allied pressure. The recognition of Johann's achievement came first from his immediate comrades, who understood that his tactical instincts and steady courage had prevented a breakthrough that could have led to complete collapse of German defenses in their sector. Word spread quickly through German positions about the farm boy who was fighting like a veteran, creating a morale boost that helped other soldiers maintain their defensive positions despite the overwhelming Allied assault. But the more significant recognition came from French officers, who after the battle identified Johann's position as having been the primary obstacle preventing their forces from achieving their objectives during the first day of the offensive. French casualties in front of Johann's machine gun position exceeded 200 killed and wounded, losses that had forced Allied commanders to divert forces to other sectors where resistance was less determined. Johann maintained his defensive position throughout the night and into the following day as Allied forces continued their offensive, but with reduced intensity after suffering heavy casualties during the initial assault. His ammunition supply was running critically low, his machine gun was overheating dangerously from continuous use, and his three companions were all wounded to varying degrees by enemy fire that had been concentrated on their position. Let us know in the comments what you think about maintaining such determination over extended periods under fire. The crisis came on the morning of July 16th, when Allied forces launched a renewed assault specifically targeting Johann's position after identifying it as the key defensive strongpoint preventing their advance. The attack included artillery support, infantry assault from multiple directions, and even attempts to outflank the position by advancing through sectors that had been considered impassable due to shell crater obstacles. Johann understood that his position was no longer tenable and that continued defense would result in death or capture for himself and his three wounded companions. But retreating would expose German forces behind him to Allied breakthrough, potentially causing casualties far exceeding his small group's losses. The decision he faced was whether to sacrifice his own life and those of his companions to maintain a defense that would save other German soldiers. His decision reflected both tactical judgment and moral courage. Rather than simply abandoning the position or fighting to the death in a futile last stand, Johann organized a fighting withdrawal that allowed his companions to retreat while he provided covering fire with his machine gun. The maneuver required Johann to remain exposed to Allied fire while his wounded comrades moved to safety, accepting personal risk to protect men who had fought beside him.
The covering fire Johann provided during the withdrawal was remarkably effective, demonstrating tactical sophistication that exceeded his minimal military training. He fired in short, precisely aimed bursts that suppressed Allied infantry without exhausting his remaining ammunition, maintained his position until his companions had reached safety, then disabled his machine gun and retreated using shell craters and destroyed equipment for cover. Johann successfully reached German defensive lines despite intense Allied fire that wounded him twice during the withdrawal, once in his left shoulder and once in his right leg.
The injuries were painful but not life-threatening, allowing him to continue functioning as a soldier even as medical personnel attempted to evacuate him for treatment. The defensive action Johann had conducted over 36 hours of continuous combat had achieved results far beyond what anyone could have expected from an inexperienced farm boy with minimal military training. His improvised machine gun team had inflicted hundreds of Allied casualties, delayed enemy advances that would have broken German defensive lines, and demonstrated that courage and tactical instinct could overcome lack of formal military experience. German military authorities recognized Johann's achievement with immediate field promotion to Unteroffizier or corporal and recommendation for the Iron Cross First Class, one of Germany's highest military decorations. But the more meaningful recognition came from the soldiers who had witnessed his defensive stand, who understood that Johann's courage and tactical skill had saved their lives and prevented German defeat during a critical phase of the battle. After receiving medical treatment for his wounds, Johann returned to his unit, where he served in various defensive actions during Germany's gradual retreat throughout the summer and autumn of 1918. His reputation as the farm boy who had become a war hero preceded him, creating expectations that he would continue demonstrating the same courage and tactical skill that had characterized his actions during the Second Battle of the Marne. But Johann himself remained characteristically modest about his achievements, consistently attributing his success to luck and the support of his companions rather than any special courage or skill. When questioned about how a farm boy with minimal training had become such an effective soldier, he offered a simple explanation. Farming teaches you to solve problems with whatever tools you have available, to remain calm during crises, and to understand that hard work and attention to detail determine whether you succeed or fail. Those same principles apply to warfare. Share your thoughts about how fundamental life skills transcend specific applications and circumstances. When the armistice ended the war on November 11, 1918, Johann returned to his family's farm in Bavaria, where he resumed the agricultural work that had been interrupted by military service. His wartime experiences had changed him profoundly, creating memories and perspectives that would influence the remainder of his life, but he never discussed his military service or the recognition he had received for his defensive action at the Marne. Johann's reluctance to discuss his military service reflected both personal humility and his understanding that warfare, regardless of individual acts of courage, represented human failure rather than achievement worth celebrating. He had witnessed too much death and destruction to romanticize warfare, and his experiences had convinced him that the true measure of human achievement lay in creation rather than destruction. The farm prospered under Johann's management throughout the 1920s and 1930s, becoming one of the most productive agricultural operations in the region. Johann married, raised 5 children, and became a respected member of his community, known for integrity, hard work, and quiet wisdom rather than military heroism. His Iron Cross remained in a drawer, rarely shown and never displayed, a private reminder of experiences he preferred to forget rather than commemorate. During the 1930s, as Nazi ideology began influencing German society and another war seemed increasingly likely, Johann became an outspoken opponent of militarism and nationalist extremism. His opposition was based not on political theory, but on practical experience. He had witnessed warfare's reality and understood that propaganda about military glory concealed truth about suffering and destruction. Johann's opposition to Nazi militarism created tensions within his community, where many people, including some of his own family members, were enthusiastic supporters of Hitler's regime. But Johann maintained his principles despite social pressure, arguing that anyone who had experienced real warfare would never support policies that made another conflict likely. When World War II began in September 1939, Johann's worst fears were realized. His two oldest sons were immediately conscripted into Wehrmacht service, despite his arguments that his World War I experience had taught him that modern warfare brought only suffering, regardless of which side achieved victory. Both sons survived the war, though one returned with severe injuries that prevented him from ever working again. Johann Schmidt died in 1962 at age 63, having lived long enough to see Germany rebuilt from the ruins of two world wars, but not long enough to witness the full reconciliation between former enemies that would eventually transform European relations. His obituary mentioned his Iron Cross and his defensive stand at the Marne, but emphasized his contributions to agricultural development and community leadership that had characterized his civilian life. The machine gun position that Johann had defended for 36 hours during the Second Battle of the Marne was eventually identified by military historians researching the battle's tactical details. The site is now marked with a small memorial recognizing the defensive action conducted there, though Johann's name appears alongside those of his three companions as equal participants in the stand rather than as the primary hero. Today, Johann's story is taught in military academies as an example of how leadership and tactical effectiveness can emerge from unexpected sources during combat operations. His transformation from inexperienced farm boy to effective combat leader within hours of his first major battle demonstrates that courage and tactical instinct cannot be instilled solely through formal training, but emerge from fundamental character qualities and practical problem-solving skills developed through civilian experiences. Unteroffizier Johann Schmidt proved that heroism in warfare often comes from ordinary people who discover extraordinary capabilities when circumstances demand them. His defensive stand at the Marne demonstrated that courage, tactical judgment, and moral integrity could coexist even during warfare's most intense moments, and that the most effective soldiers are sometimes those who maintain humanity and practical wisdom alongside military effectiveness. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to share your thoughts.